Hello, and welcome to Conversations with GLF. Today, we are discussing trees with two amazing people. All my life, I've prayed to trees, and I believe the trees in the vicinity of my village where I grew up, they have witnessed my deepest desires, grief, and all those emotions you cannot possibly confess to another human being. And not just mine, my parents, my grandparents, and all the people in my bloodline. And I cannot help but look at trees with an animistic eye. So today we are discussing trees with the T.R. Shankar Raman and Aparna Karthikeyan. T.R. Shankar Raman likes to imagine he's a writer turned wildlife scientist turned writer. His writing, emerging from close observations over the years and field experiences across India, evoke new and immersive perceptions of nature. His earlier books include a collection of his essays, In the Wild Heart of India, Nature and Conservation in the City, the Country, and the Wild. He also co-authored Pillars of Life, Magnificent Trees of the Western Ghats with his partner Divya Muddappa. Together as scientists of the Nature Conservation Foundation, they now lead a program to restore tropical rainforests based out of Field Research Station in the Annamalai Hills of the Western Ghats. Aparna Karthikeyan is a Chennai based independent journalist and author. Her non-fiction book, 9 Rupees an Hour, documents the disappearing livelihoods of rural Tamil Nadu. She has written 5 books for children. Aparna's award winning series on 8 crops in Tamil Nadu, Let Them Eat Rice, will be published as an anthology by Westland Books in December 2026. So over to you, Aparna.
Thank you so much, Monisha, and thank you so much for getting me to do this. Sir, first and foremost, I love the book. It is absolutely incredible. Such a joy to hold this book in my hand. And as you can see, I have so many questions for you. Looking forward very much to hearing your thoughts, on the book and how it came about and all of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Delighted to be here. And yeah.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Monisha, for having us. This is such a pleasure. So I'll start with the most obvious question, sir. How did you select 50 trees to represent what you say is like, we have 3,000 native species in India. So what was it like to, distill it down to 50?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the most difficult aspects of the book. I had to look at India's extraordinary diversity of trees and pick 50 that would encapsulate that diversity as well as act as a window to the land that is India. And when I actually searched for lists of tree species of India, I found that there wasn't actually one authoritative list. There are a couple of lists, but they vary a lot. And, some lists include a lot of the non-native species that have been brought in the past. So I had to figure out my own list of species and then pay some attention to it. But ultimately, what I wanted to do with this book was to look at trees per se. Of course, each of the species I chose would be my central focus. I wanted to write about its life and its connections to the land and to the other species around. But they needed to be distributed across the country in the different ecosystems. So I had to pick, and I tried to pick trees from the Lakshadweep as well as from Andaman and Nicobar Islands, then along the Western Ghats, Eastern Ghats, Central India, then all along the Himalaya. Even within the Himalaya, you have, a range of forest types going into the cold deserts of Ladakh. And then we have the hot deserts, we have mangroves. So it's just extraordinary. But I had to pick something related to all of that. The second sort of thing that was behind, my thinking was that the trees themselves are extraordinarily diverse, right? In their character, some of them are gigantic emergents of rainforest. Some of them are so small that you may not even notice it as a tree. It's more like a shrub than a tree. In fact, there is one species which is like an underground tree.
Yes.
What we call geoxides. So I had to pick, I wanted to reflect that diversity as well. So it was very difficult. And, especially if you like trees, you have a lot of favorites that you want to bring in. But that would have made, maybe parts of the Western Ghats really cluttered, because I know a lot of species from here and it's a favorite. This is where I work. So I had to whittle that out. I This is the initial list had over 120 species, which my wife Divya and I sat together and made. And then from that we slowly struck off some. And then while writing, I made some changes and dropped some and selected others. So that's finally how this 50 came. And I think they do a good job of capturing those two things, of the diversity of India as well as the diversity of lifestyles among the trees themselves. But there are certainly misses as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. I think that diversity really brilliantly comes across. So we'll, hopefully discuss some of those points, as we go. So you look at trees beyond the economic value. I think that's something that you have been, very careful to stress throughout the book. Beyond the ecosystem services, beyond like cubic feet of timber, kgs of resin. But the book looks at the trees, the literally trees at the center of the world. How did you manage to achieve it? This bit from page 17, if I can just, couple of lines, if I can read from that. So you talk about this. In contrast, modern forestry has viewed sal, in the sal chapter, as a resource to be exploited. In one 471-page manual of silviculture of dipterocarp trees in India, updated in 1980, 309 pages are devoted to sal alone, viewed primarily as a timber resource. So, I mean, that is the kind of, thinking that policy perhaps, has centered. And here you're shifting that entire thing away into a very different world. How did you get to do that?
Um, I think my understanding of trees has come from being a naturalist and an ecologist. And I see trees as having very, very rich lives and very rich connections to ecosystems, to other species. So, when you have that kind of a perspective, and then you pick up the standard books that are available on trees, including various forestry volumes or even other field guides and books on trees. One of the things you'll see is that there are brief descriptions of the tree or where it is found, etc. And then most of the focus goes into its uses. What are the uses of this tree for us, right? So it's timber, it is medicine, it's resin, etc. In fact, when I started writing this book and I was telling a few people that I'm working on the book, one of the first questions they would ask is, "Oh, you're going to tell us about the uses of the tree?" And I said, perhaps not, because many of the other books that have come so far have highlighted uses, and practically every tree that you take will have a variety of uses, either to indigenous communities or the other. And that's actually besides the point. And there is much more to the life of the tree. And we need to see what is it that the trees are in themselves. They are living beings. We need to respect that, and we need to see the connections to land and to other lives. So that's the perspective I wanted to bring here. I also felt that the wider sort of environmental problems that we see, or the way we look at nature itself as a resource to be exploited, comes from this kind of framing which we see in trees. That here is something, it is of use to us. It is a resource to be exploited. And that changes the way we look at land and how we relate to land, which is very different from, say, how the indigenous people or many of the communities respond. They relate differently. It's not that indigenous people don't use trees or resources from trees, but they have a much more respectful relationship. Even if it is utilitarian, there is a respectful relationship, and they always recognize it as a relationship. It is not as something that here is a resource and I have it in my power to exploit. And I think that framing needed to change. it's changed in the modern context. You often see it framed like this, that nature has ecosystem services to provide to us, right? So, but it's just I would say it's more semantic kind of change, but it comes from the same perspective. It originates in the same perspective of seeing nature as a resource to be exploited. And I think we need to change that perspective if we are to first understand our environmental problems and begin to solve them. So that's why I kept this book entirely, I tried to keep that perspective right through the book. It's not that I don't mention some uses that a particular tree has. In some contexts, it's really important to also acknowledge and to mention it. But I didn't want to foreground that. I don't think that should be in the foreground. It should be in the background of our understanding of trees.
Fantastic, sir. Thank you. There is a question about Mahua and Tendu. It's one of the questions that I have, and it's exactly what you spoke about. But the next question also, I think, builds on what you said about the indigenous communities. It's about the Nicobar bittersweet. So that thin line between development and destruction, and who enjoys the first and who pays for the latter. And that came through so powerfully in this story, and that human centricness of the whole idea. And I think in that chapter there is one thing, of course, apart from the very interesting thing that that tree was impossible to find. There is this also very interesting thing that it is possible, even likely, that the Shompen and the Nicobaris know the tree, have a name for it, use it for various purposes, while it remained unknown to botanists. I found that extremely powerful. So what will oil palm? So I have a couple of questions regarding this. What will oil palm do to this kind of a diversity? That's one thing. Although that's a very obvious question, but I still think we need to reiterate it. And the second part is the naming conventions, of all the trees. It valorizes a certain kind of knowledge system. It valorizes a certain kind of people's understanding of a tree and the ecosystem over, say, the Shompen and the Nicobaris, right? So I'd like you to comment on that as well, sir.
Yeah, I mean, there are many, many issues at stake here. And so the reason I mentioned that is that it's probably true that a lot of what is called discoveries of species and the naming of species under Western scientific traditions has actually built upon indigenous knowledge. People have gone to these areas, they have explored, even if there was, let's say, the British explorers, they were collecting plants and sending them to the Kew Gardens or to UK, and there were scientists naming new species and it was a catalog of life that was being built over time. But most often, the local people who led these people through these landscapes, who almost certainly knew these plants and had local names for them, they were rarely acknowledged in these sources. Even in the paintings, the company paintings, which is like the early botanical art that comes from India, a lot of those paintings appeared in publications and so on with no mention of the painters. We didn't know who they were and so on. Only recently people have tried to look into it. We now know the names of some of these painters who meticulously sketched this and so on. So that knowledge itself, although it looks like it was built up by foresters and people with sort of a scientific tradition, it was actually a sort of a joint building of knowledge that involved both indigenous, traditional knowledge as well as Western science coming together.
Right.
And I think that is really crucial. In the absence of that, we'll have these kind of one-off things where we don't know much about a species, or we rely entirely on, herbarium specimens and reports in journals. And I think our knowledge will end up being partial in that respect. And Nicobar is very much in the news, the Great Nicobar Island, because of this massive project that is being planned there. And I've written about it, and you may have read a lot about it as well. There are two concerns there. One is that a very large tract of forest, nearly 130 square kilometers of practically intact tropical rainforest, which belongs in the Sunda region biodiversity hotspot. It's a unique part of India with its own set of species. That 130 square kilometers or 13,000 hectares of forest is going to be destroyed for creating a city, a power plant, tourism facilities, lots of commercial things besides the certain strategic defense installations and the port itself. The estimates of number of trees to be logged and lost there is around 850,000 or so. But as I've written in this book, and many others have said, it is probably an underestimate. It may be a factor of 10 more than that. That's the kind of scale of loss that we are facing, and along with it, we lose that. We won't face that loss. I mean, it was going to affect us as well. But the first people it's going to affect are the Shompen, who are the forest dwelling, particularly vulnerable tribal group. A few hundred of them live on that island, and it's going to hit them hard. And we are going to not just lose the forest, we lose their knowledge of the forest, an opportunity to understand how it is that into the present day in 2026, we have human communities that have managed to live alongside and protect and conserve this kind of remarkably diverse tropical rainforests. That's something that's going to go. And although oil palm is not planned, as far as I know, on Great Nicobar, it's planned on other Nicobar islands, including one of the other islands where there are reports of the same tree that I've written about, the tree called Nicobario slumeri. And there, in this island, there is already an oil palm plantation that came up many, many years ago, and it has failed. But in its push to increase oil palm cultivation, that island has been again targeted for expanding. Kachal has been again targeted for expanding of this oil palm plantations. It's also happening in many parts of Northeast India, which is another biodiversity hotspot. And oil palm is established as very intensive monocultures. I've written about this extensively in my previous book, The Wild Heart of India, where I've studied the oil palm and its impacts on biodiversity, birds, and forests in Northeast India. And it basically signifies a permanent deforestation, a permanent loss of highly biodiverse forests by a single crop plantation, which has very, very low biodiversity. It also has consequences on the water table. It will, affect our stream flow and, many other such concerns. So do we want these kinds of development in what are perhaps some of our most ecologically valuable areas? That is something that as a nation and as a citizens, we should think about. And I try to, bring that up in this chapter.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. The next one is sort of building on this, I think. You talk about the tree as a prop for the tigers. And I love that, phrasing that you used of the prop, the habitat, quote unquote. And while the conservation story has changed, spotlighting tigers rather than the teak that is there in the forest, the tree anyway there remains in the shadow. You write there about the dock tree, the Terminalia pendula. So what is the fate of this champion survivor of the rocky landscape of Western India, particularly the Aravalli Hills?
Yeah. So, first I have to confess something, which is that this is something that even I have done as a wildlife scientist. In my own training as a wildlife scientist, I began by studying wildlife. Most of my research is on birds. And so when we look at animals, when we look at birds and we go out to study them, we often see that all the plants in the background as habitat. It's just the habitat of these. And we don't look at them in their own right. And that is something that I came to only much later, when I started looking much closer at trees in particular. And I felt that you can't just look at these as habitat for the animals and focus all your conservation and your attention there. You have to look at them, directly as well. And I think that has influenced this particular essay as well. And if you go to any of these tiger safari parks in central India and Rajasthan, it's really crazy to see people and almost the entire tourism industry geared to just take people to show tigers, you know, uh, and uh, and so many people, you'll see 30, 40 jeeps clustered around a single tiger, which has no interest in any of those people, and it's just lying there. And it always struck me that you're in the middle of a fantastic landscape. Let's say you're in Corbett or you're in Tadoba or you're, in this case, in this essay, it was in Ranthambore. And Ranthambore is such a spectacular landscape. There's so much to see around. You want to focus everything on the tiger and all the efforts related to the tiger. So that was at the back of my head. The other thing is that the tree itself is remarkable. The Terminalia pendula is a remarkable tree of the Aravalis. It's such a beautiful tree with its colors, in the different seasons, and also this unique habit of the tree of being possibly clonal. Again, there's not much research on it, but it's possible that an entire stand of trees that you're looking, although they look like so many different individuals, they could all be one tree, clonally connected below ground, and perhaps communicating with each other and so on, based on what we know of other research on other species coming today. So it's a very, very different perspective. There's so much, so interesting things just looking at that species. And along the Aravallis, that particular tree, Terminalia pendula, is very, very important. You can see what's happening in the Delhi Ridge today, right? So there's a plan. The Delhi Ridge would have had stands of Terminalia pendula, the oak tree, and unfortunately, a lot of it had been cut, and the entire area had been overrun by invasive plants like the Prosopis or Meltuma juliflora. And today, people are trying uh, to sort of bring back the original ecosystem, but often doing enormous damage in the process. Uh, Even as we speak, there are bulldozers going around in Central Ridge, basically ripping off all the plants and ripping off the biocrust of the soil and creating these park-like ones with, bougainvillea and tecoma, these standard municipal garden plants, instead of species like Terminalia pendula, bringing the dhok back to that, bringing the Aravali ecosystem would have been so nice. Instead, we have a completely misguided kind of application of uh, the idea of regreening being carried out in the Aravalis. So I wanted to, foreground this species and talk a little bit about it and put it in contrast to that tiger, which is like the species that gathers all the attention, and say that, look, if you're putting so much attention on the tiger, here's a tree that deserves at least as much, if not more, attention than the tiger itself.
Great. Thank you. Um, so I'll move on to Mizoram from the Aravallis, from Ranthambore. Here you have the landscape historian of Mizoram, as you call the Tufar. And, it's very beautifully written about how it spins its story of the last couple of million years, right? And the Podokap family recounts a saga of deep time, as you call it. And that was really a goosebump, chapter. Really gave me goosebumps. So it's testimony to the greatest upheavals of earth. And here is a tray that stays rooted, that never moves, and yet can tell stories. I think that, this tree really brings about that aspect of the book extremely well. This chapter really brings that about. So if textbooks that we read are about, aging trees through concrete rings, you've shown us something very, very different about trees. Can you tell us a little more about this shift in way of looking at it?
Yeah. So, India has a lot of these ancient trees. People call them elder flora, they call them elder trees, and so on. Some of them we've tried to identify them as heritage trees, etc. But in many parts of India, at least in the drier tracts and in the rainforests, most of the species actually are not very old. Very old in the sense of, in relation to other trees, they may be a few hundred years old, which is still quite a lot for us. But there are, among trees itself, there are some species like the conifers, which can be thousands of years old. I've written about how there are more than 900-year-old deodars. There are junipers that are at least 1,500 years old. that people have studied, and these are all conifers. And Podocarpus, that's the
Mhm.
species that I've written about, set in Mizoram, is also a conifer, but it's a very different kind of conifer. First of all, it's not found in the temperate forests in the cold upper reaches where you expect to see conifers. It is sitting in a rainforest,
Mhm.
and the leaves look different and so on. So it's a very uncharacteristic conifer, but still it while the other conifers like the deodar and the juniper have been studied by looking at what's called dendrochronology. You know, people look at a sort of a slice of the tree, they take a core out of the tree and they count the rings
Mhm.
and go back centuries. And
Mhm.
based on the width of the rings, you can tell each year whether it was a good year or a bad year, etc. And so you're
Mhm.
basically tracing ecological history
Uh-huh.
or the history of the life of that particular tree using
Mhm.
those rings. Now, in Podocarpus, as far as I know, that has not happened. But
Mhm.
what's more interesting in this case is that in the genetics and in the species itself, there is this history of deep time. Because as a conifer, this genus of Podocarpus is primarily found in the in this in the hemisphere or on the continents related to the Gondwanan uh, original continent. So today you find it wherever the Gondwanan continent's remnants are. And India, as you remember, was part of the Gondwana and it split off and then collided with Asia. So and that history has been traced through genetics and when the species had evolved and so on. So I thought that's really nice to know that today I can walk in and look at this tree and it tells me the history of continental upheavals and of deep time. So even here in the Western Ghats, we have a relative of the Podocarpus called Nageya valchiana, which looks sort of similar and is also found in the rainforest, which is another such species. So I have sort of brought this in the essay.
Great, thank you. Um, so we'll move to the Western Ghats, to the coffee plantation that you have a familial relationship with, and the Indian Malabar rosewood, as it's called in the furniture industry, as you point out, and that again was very interesting. So you say this, and which again was so poignant. Spend a few moments with BT. There's a good chance you'll appreciate the rosewood tree more alive than dead. Again, really powerful. It's also a very hopeful essay, among a lot of essays which do kind of make you feel very heavy. This is a very hopeful essay that in 1.15 degraded acres can be turned into a lush plantation in 5 decades of time. So in a lifetime, change is possible if the right people put in the correct kind of efforts. And it was also such an important essay, I think, because it says something about the consumer preferences and how it can shape an ecosystem. Can you tell us a bit about how coffee can shape, how coffee has shaped that ecosystem?
Yeah, I think there are lots of coffee drinkers in India, and I wonder how many of them know exactly where their coffee comes from. And today, of course, you could be buying coffee from any part of the world where coffee comes from. But a lot of Indian coffee comes from just the state of Karnataka. Of course, there is some coffee grown in Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and a few other states, but the bulk of it comes from Karnataka, from Kodagu as well as Chikmagalur districts. And so this essay about the rosewood is set in Kodagu district,
Uh-huh.
which has a lot of the dry deciduous forests, and it's part of the native distributional range of the Dalbergia, the rosewood tree that I've written about. And we must understand that today there are a lot of areas which were earlier forest which has been transformed somehow by human action. Yeah, so I was saying that coffee as traditionally grown in parts of Kodagu district offer a good example of how um, our impact on land can be gentle, and we can
Mhm.
still derive resources such as coffee from the landscape. So historically, if you see, more Kodagu coffee was grown under the shade of a lot of native trees, including species like the BT or Dalbergia. Uh, and studies have shown up to 200 species of trees in the coffee landscape in Cool. And coffee is the Arabica coffee is a sort of a shade-grown plant. So you grow it in the shade of these trees. So by integrating trees as well as the crop, you're able to harvest the crop as well as support the environment in terms of many of the species that survive, the trees themselves, the birds, and the bees that are very important in the landscape. And the bees are important not just to the trees in terms of pollination, but also for the coffee as well. So retaining the trees actually helps the coffee as well.
Right.
In addition to this, in Kodagu, people have traditionally protected some patches of forest as Devakadu or Devrakadu, the sacred groves. Today, a lot of them have been lost. There were literally thousands of them, and many hundreds have disappeared or become so small that they're just a single tree or they're untraceable. But this was a traditional system that had protected patches of forest in the coffee landscape. And today, scientists are showing that if you retain patches of forest close to coffee, it actually benefits the coffee as well, because it hosts a lot of species, including the bees, such as the rock bee, that creates nests on these tall trees. And then they go out and pollinate the flowers in the wider landscape. And so this, when I wrote about this essay, it's my own in-laws' coffee plantation, and right now looked after by my mother-in-law, who's like a fierce defender of trees. So she, and earlier my father-in-law, when he was alive, used to protect these trees, and they had a very pragmatic understanding of this landscape. And I think we need to sort of learn from this and step back and look at it and see how to make our impact on the land a little more gentle. And I was able to draw some of these connections by looking at the BT tree or the rosewood tree, rather than just describing it as a valuable timber which has such a nice color and so on and so forth. Which is actually not very interesting.
Great, thank you. So I'll move on to, because you said about the defender of trees, you have written very political essays where people have defended large tracts of trees, in India, and they've served as models, for the rest of the world to emulate. And the word tree hugger probably, came from there, you've said. So as a side comment, very recently I was looking at a video where there was a wildfire. I think it was somewhere in the US. And there's this one gentleman posting saying that, wildfire is raging, we've lost our home. Very tragic, of course. And he's talking about that. And then somebody is coming and commenting in that, using this word tree hug, like a pejorative, and says that, all these wildfires are happening because of tree huggers. And I was so gobsmacked, I didn't know how to react to it, right? Like the whole turning of the table, so to speak, gaslighting comment. So that is one part of it. Whereas in the other part of it, you have, the native trees, native landscapes that have been supported in the Garhwal in the Himalayas, in Niyamagiri, all these places where people have shown that, collectivization, public participation, and, strong demonstration of their rights, can actually protect the landscape. So whether it's the Chipko and the Angu tree, how have they resisted these states and corporations, and have there been other examples like this around the world as well?
I think there are numerous examples, both from within India and around the world, when citizens have come together and strongly protested against or worked to protect their own landscapes, lives, livelihood, trees. Very recently, you saw people coming out on the streets near Rishikesh to protect the trees there. We know of other examples like the Chevalla banyans in Andhra, where people came to protect. So we can think of many such examples, and even in our past, going all the way back to the Kejarli, and how the people of who lived around Jodhpur rose to defend the KSD trees there. We, of course, have the Chipko movement as well. So there are a number of such examples here and in other parts of the world, but there are also significant, I wouldn't say failures, but places where intense movements have still not managed to succeed as well. And in India, we have examples of those on one side, like in Hasdeo Arand. Tribals have been campaigning for so long. They've gone on marches, they've gone on hartals, but still we are poised to destroy more than 240,000 trees in the expansion of mining there. So it is uh, I would say that both kinds of cases are there, but what we could say is, oh, and there's a third kind as well, which is like in Nicobar, where we have, communities like the Shompen who practically don't have a voice. We don't even know. It's very difficult to even understand because they have their own, language. So nobody knows or will be able to know what they feel. And they, being such a marginalized community, they may not even have a voice in the larger sort of debate that is going on today. So you have all these sort of cases. But I feel that what we can learn from this is that when people get together and rise to defend what they feel is important, it can have very important successes as well. And we shouldn't let the pace of onslaught or the kind of changes that we are seeing around us deter us from acting and raising our voice and standing up with these groups. So somewhere in the book, I've also mentioned that many people, when we're going about our own lives, we have our jobs, we have our other things. How can I help when something like this is going on? And I always feel that even if you can't go and join in an activism sort of role, there are many ways in which you can lend your voice to it. Even if you're joining a campaign, whether it's an online campaign, whether it's a contribution to somebody who is trying to lead this, there are many ways of participation in this. And I think we should try and encourage all of that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Actually, the next question is about the Hastioarand forest. So it is about Tendu and Mahua, where you have written about billions of Tendu leaves to make 1 trillion BDs, every single year, and every last one of them made to go up in smoke. Again, extremely hard-hitting line, but then it's also some kind of a, what shall I say, a livelihood, right? Like whole economies rest on these trees without destroying the forest. So it's a very interesting way of looking at it. It sustains large populations of the trees and the people, right? And again in Mahua, where you say that each tree can produce about 300 kilograms of flowers, which is a huge number. And whether it's lightly processed and whether it's fermented into a drink or whether it's dried and sold, however it is. So my question here is, we have on the one hand the bogey of development and the destruction of these landscapes. On the other hand, we have, as you said with the Shompen, we have a hard to understand, what people really want there. Is there a thing about, aspiration, a way of life that they, would prefer, or are they happy with what they're doing? Because they are seen as the stewards of the forest. Are they not even being given that title of a steward of a forest, right? Like they've literally been seen as just somebody who's going there and, foraging for their daily life. So, I mean, again, it's like a stripping of people, their individual rights, their agency, their knowledge, all of it, right? So I want you to talk about that tussle, because between what people want, what they have, that sort of thing.
Yeah, at a slightly broader level, I would say let's ask the question this way.
Yeah.
What is it that economics and development, the way we are doing today, what is it that they can learn from ecology and nature?
Right.
And there is a lot that they can learn, even if you look at just these two species, the Mahua and the Tindu. Although I haven't maybe stated it very explicitly, the message that comes is that here you have examples of species where people have sustained themselves and sustained the populations of those trees over hundreds of years or millennia without wiping it extinct. In fact, it's inconceivable today that those two species of trees will go extinct in the central Indian landscape. It's not possible. They are common, they're cherished, they are used by a lot of people, and there is a relationship between people and the tree that is maybe utilitarian, but like I mentioned earlier, it's also respectful. It is in a sense uh, conservation in reality, right?
Right.
There are many other examples also, like I've so written about the Boswellia serrata tree and which the Saharias, uh, another community, have a similar relationship with the tree from which they tap the resin, so on. So that's on the human side. But also, these trees are connected to a lot of animals. Like in the case of the mahua tree,
Mm-hmm.
the populations of the mahua tree are probably sustained by bats, which we're
Wow.
not even recognizing, right? The bats are very important both for pollination, they eat the fruits and they disperse the seeds, and possibly other animals as well. But bats play a crucial role, and they help to bring the idea of regeneration. Can
Mm-hmm.
we consume only
Mm-hmm.
what we can also regenerate,
Right. Right.
right? So that's the central question. I don't know if people who are planning a development trajectory are asking that question.
Right. Right.
It is more a question of efficiency. How can I efficiently remove or extract resources? Or, it becomes a completely different kind of approach towards nature as compared to what we can learn from these people and from trees like this. And there's been a lot of other work directly on the communities, on the tribal communities in central India, and I have not gone into that because my focus in the book was mostly on the trees themselves. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from the people
Right.
there.
So we'll move on to the ecosystem engineers in Meghalaya and the really interesting natural, the tree bridges of the Dingri tree, if I'm pronouncing it right. And you also start this essay by talking about a lot of bridges in the natural ecosystem. That was very interesting to me. We don't think about it that way, except when it's like a man-made bridge. So could you talk about both the natural existing bridges and the man-made bridges? Mm.
Yeah, so the idea in this chapter, I've tried to bring in several things. It's the idea of engineering. When you say somebody is an engineer or
Mhm.
is doing engineering, it's considered like a pinnacle of human achievement, right?
Mhm.
Engineers are, smart people and they build these wonderful things and so on. But the ficus trees themselves are sometimes called as ecosystem engineers. They're engineering entire ecosystems through their lives, their connections to other life forms, and how they sustain them, and so on. So that's on one side. The other thing is the idea of the bridges themselves. And bridges are something that engineers construct,
Mhm.
cross a river, and so on. But nature is full of bridges. You have these lianas that go from tree to tree, and so many times we have seen animals, from slender lorises, the civets, they use them to cross across. And these are self-formed, self-maintained bridges in the canopy. That's just one example, and I've given a few others there, even behavioral examples. But the D tree itself, which is Ficus elastica, is
Mhm.
remarkable in that it brings both human ingenuity and the natural adaptability of the species together in a manner that is completely inseparable. So it's a brilliant example of that coming together. And of course, that entire landscape and that species, everything is just mind blowing. So here was one of the species that I, struggled because there are so many interesting figs, the wild figs. The Dangerous Ficus elastica, and there's so many interesting wild figs in India that I could have written about. There's the banyan, there's the people, there are the wild figs that we find in the rainforest here. And I had to leave several of them out to focus on this. So it was a tough choice, but I think I've tried to bring that here because there is a lot we can learn from nature, and it also helps to knock down the human hubris a little bit when we do that.
Great, thank you. Um, Yeah, so we'll go on to Assam. We'll move from Meghalaya to Assam. And here you have said something again that was so powerful and so poignant. The extraordinary biological richness, fertility, and natural wealth of the Brahmaputra Valley in Assam contrast sharply with the state's present place among the bottom 6 or 7 states in India in human development. How could a state that has supported decades of timber exploitation, over 170 years of lucrative tea plantations and exports, bounties of agricultural and horticultural produce and fisheries, besides oil and mineral production, and with multiple transport networks by river, road, and rail, become and remain as poor as it is today? It is as if development and capital arrived only to be snatched away, as they do even today, leaving Assam none the better of it. And this was in the chapter about holong trees and gibbons. This is something that we see in many of the really rich ecosystems in India and across the world. How does one set this right?
I think we have to, setting it right will require us working from the ground up. And also for us to understand where we are today in relation to ecological history. So
Okay.
in this chapter, what I've tried to do is give a sense of that ecological history through looking at this tree and that last remnant of rainforest, of the lowland rainforest that we have in Upper Assam, in the Gibbon Wildlife Sanctuary, or what's called Holongapar. It's a small patch left of what used to be an extensive tract of rainforest. How did it come to this? How did we arrive at this juncture? And the traditional explanation for it would be that, okay, this is something we have to suffer for. This is a price to suffer for development, right? Development requires us to make certain compromises on nature. But what exactly then leads us to question the development itself? And Assam has always struck me as a remarkable example of this. Think anything that you think of as development, okay, we need to expand agriculture, we need to expand horticulture, we need to expand fisheries, transport networks, mining, commodity crops. Assam has had all of it. We had some of the earliest the oil extraction coming from Assam. The first tea plantations were established in Assam. We've had the rivers and the railways and the roads come up, and so much very productive agriculture. And all of this has happened. All of this is development, right? As we conventionally frame it. If Assam has had such a long history of development, why is it where is it today? So then I think what looking at it this way is to question that whole narrative of development and say we need to rethink this and move forward.
Yeah.
And I have in this book tried not to preach or to be very prescriptive, saying, okay, I think this is the solution, this is the solution. And I leave it to the imagination of the reader to a large extent, or to some suggestions. And here in this chapter, my only suggestion has been to contemplate the seeds of that last few holong trees, how the trees which persist there are still sending those seeds, spinning away into the landscape, hoping for revival. And it's just a metaphor. But I think if we think of this differently, and if we think of how we can revive ecosystems and think of it in terms of renewal, we may arrive at a different juncture.
We're down to the last couple of questions, last two questions. We'll go to the Himalayas, and where you talk about the deodars. And you did mention previously about, how you can take a core from the deodar, the core sample, and you can tell the stories of climate events of the past. Huh? How far back can you really reconstruct with trees?
Good question. I don't know exactly how far back we can go with trees, around the world, but certainly we can go a few thousand years. And with the work in India, I think with the deodar and with other species of conifers, people have been able to trace back at least 2,000 to 3,000 years. And it may not be from a single tree. It may be from multiple trees which are, at different times. Sometimes the roots are older than the tree, the stem above. The stem above might be younger, but the roots can be much older in conifers. And there are conifers known in other parts of the world which may be 3,000, 4,000 years old, or even some estimates say going up to maybe 8 to 10,000 years old. So that's practically, our human history from the dawn of agriculture till today. So there's a lot that we can learn from these trees, and there's some excellent research coming from India on this, on dendrochronology. The Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleobotany is one of the leading institutes. So I've tapped into their research to write parts of these chapters as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. The last one is you write about not being able to see two of the trees. Yes, I mean, we have, spoken about some of the trees that you could not write about, like you spoke about the ficus species that you could not. Um, but then there were also some very beautiful everyday trees that you have written about, like you wrote about the paramalli, the jasmine, the palm, the coconut, the trees are all that are like, familiar. They're my friends, I have some of them in my own house. How did you balance this, these really exotic, if I can use that word, although it may not be correct, but really out there trees that I will never hope in my lifetime to see. And then the everyday and the ordinary, and this whole thing. And then what did you really feel bad about missing out?
Yeah, again, it goes back to our first question of choice of trees. And there were some trees for which I felt a personal connection as well. Both the jackfruit tree, the chapter that I've written, which is set in Kerala, and the Pavramalli, which is set in Chennai, which is where I grew up. The tree was right there in my backyard,
Nice.
and so I wanted to bring these, and both because of it may these are familiar trees, and I've tried to present the familiar trees in a slightly different way as compared to what you may read about it elsewhere. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that even for a species like the Pavramalli, which is the Nyctanthus arbortristis, the scientific name, or the coral jasmine.
Uh-huh.
This tree is so common, like you just mentioned. It's there in so many gardens. Practically everyone would know it. In the north, they would know it as Parijat, and in the West Bengal, they know it as Shiuli. It's so familiar. But when you look at, as an ecologist, when I tried to look at research onto the lives of these trees, which is what my book is about, I found that most people had not bothered to study the natural history and the ecology of the tree. They were again looking at it, even a species such as this, mostly instrumental. What are the uses? What dyes can I extract from the flower? Or what can I use the rough leaves for, and so on. And I felt a little sad about that. And that's why that chapter, probably chapter, is also called The Tree of Sorrow, which is literally the translation of its scientific name. And I wanted to convey that right there in our own backyards, right around in our surroundings, there are many such trees which may seem familiar to us, but which have a larger dimension to their lives and much more fascinating things about them that we are still yet to discover. And I wanted some of that excitement and some of that wonder to come into these chapters. So those trees got it included. And I'm sorry, I'm slightly distracted. There are lion-tailed macaques outside my window, and they are on a jamun tree. Yeah. So they're just frolicking on the jamun tree. And so one of the species I wrote about is the Kullenia exarellata, which is one of their favorite fruits. And although it may seem it's like a wild durian, although it may seem like you said, exotic or not unfamiliar native species from one corner of India, in this landscape and to species like this, that is the most familiar or most dominant tree of the rainforest here. So it may be unfamiliar in the wider context, but in that context of that region or for the particular ecosystem, these trees are very, very important. So I brought those in. But there were a lot of trees that I couldn't bring in, and it will be a regret. For instance, there are no trees in the family Lauraceae, which is the cinnamon family, cinnamon or avocado family. I could have written about cinnamons. I could have written about several of the other, Lixias and Persia. So there are entire families of trees missing. There's so many families of trees as well. And but I possibly could not have brought all of them in. So there are many of such misses. But I still hope that the species that are included are telling the story of the land that is in there.
Thank you. And just a quick shout out to Manali Patil for the brilliant, brilliant illustrations. It really brings the book alive, and I've been very closely looking at some of the pictures. I mean, if it's possible to include some of her, pictures in. I don't know. I just love them. I really, really love them. This is the Tree Bridge. And yeah, she's done a great job of bringing the book alive. And really hope there's another book on another 50 trees sometime. And the 50 trees that you wanted to write about but didn't get into the first volume. So yeah.
Yeah. So I'd just like to say a few words about that as well. Manali was, has her work has literally raised this book above the ordinary. And she's done a wonderful job. And it was a pleasure working with her. She's very meticulous. And she put a lot of, many of the trees she had not seen herself. And we had to do this through discussions, through photographs. So she read the essays and she, did a wonderful job of bringing them to life on the page. The other thing is that India has, like I mentioned earlier, a long tradition of botanical art. So it's not like the first botanical art to appear. There has been many other books. Even our own earlier book called Pillars of Life featured many of the species in the Western Ghats done by another artist. But what sets apart this from, say, the company paintings, which the botanical art that came in the British period, so if you look at a lot of those paintings, they are also very beautiful, but they are often placed without context. So they are based on a herbarium specimen or a twig, and it's very beautifully painted. So you'll have a twig of leaves, and you have the flowers. But what Manali's task was to present the tree in its entirety, and in relation to the landscape it belongs to, and in relation to other species that are there. So she drew the tree, she drew elements of the tree in great detail. She showed some of the wildlife that belong,
Yeah.
or are connected to the tree. And so that I think is something very different and unusual and, special to this book. And I think that's what made the book what it is. So big thanks to Manali for her work, and without which this book would not have been what it is.
Yeah, thank you. That's it for me, and such a pleasure to engage with you with the book and for a chance to do this. Over to you, Monisha.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
sir. No, please finish up
Yeah,
first.
no, I just wanted to thank Aparna for this. It's really nice to talk about the book and with someone who likes trees and who's gone through the book in such great detail. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Yeah. Yes, sir. There's one question from us. I would also have a personal question. I'll take it off record if that is okay with you.
Sure.
Yeah. So, given that your work is about regeneration, you just said, around native trees, there are many seeds, and sometimes those things never come up, the other saplings or whatever it is. I've seen this around our sacred trees as well in the Nilgiris where I'm from. So there's one sacred trees I see like hundreds of seeds strewn around, and there's nothing comes up. Actually, I've never seen any tree or a small, even a two leaves sprout up from anything around. This is not just with one species, with multiple species. And given this kind of scenario, with climate change or more heat that the mountains have right now, even when your field, when animal is where you work, how is regeneration possible for you? What kind of challenges do you face on the field?
Yeah, so it's a very good observation that often you have a lot of seeds falling below the tree, but hardly any regeneration, right? And we've also seen it. I have mentioned it in relation to a couple of species. And from an ecological perspective, what people say is that it's often important to move the seeds some distance away from the parent tree. Because if all the seeds fall below it, most of them will not survive, or it will attract fungal infection, it'll attract beetles, it'll attract rodents, because it's like a cafeteria, right? All the food is right there. I just have to come there and eat it. So the further the seed gets away from the tree, the higher its chances of survival. And that's what the birds and the bats and others do. They eat it and they drop it some distance away, and there's a big increase in the probability of its survival if it's landed on a good spot. So fostering and maintaining those sort of species that perform seed dispersal is very important in conservation. In the context of sacred trees, what often happens is that the area around the sacred tree, the tree itself may be revered and protected, the area around it is completely transformed. People often have their entire festivals there. The ground is completely compacted. There's no chance of anything growing there. So, but if you pick up those seeds and take them to a place where they can be grown, you can begin to start restoring and reviving these ecosystems. And that's what we do. In the last 26 years, we've been carrying out a long-term ecological restoration project in the rainforests of the Annamalai Hills. And that's how it's engaging with trees and with this whole restoration process that I went from being just a birder to someone who's paying so much more attention to trees these days. And almost all the seeds that we collect are collected from roads, from trails, or from these kind of spots, where you have a lot of seeds falling, where most of them don't have a chance of sprouting or growing. Or even if they sprout, they're often cut or they're sprayed with herbicide, etc. So we pick up those seeds. It's like an act of rescue. And we take them to a nursery where we raise the plants. And then when the plants are big enough, we plant them out in degraded sites, which are many such areas are there in every landscape. Even in the Nilgiris now, actually, we have an ongoing restoration project near Kunur, where we have 2 nurseries set up where we're raising, close to 100 species of trees, and they are being planted out in abandoned coffee plantations, areas that had eucalyptus plantation earlier, trying to bring back the shola. They're also having a small grass nursery, because Nilgiris also has grassland. So there's a grassland restoration as well. So these kind of efforts are certainly possible, and there are now many examples from around the country. Many of them are simply driven by citizens. You don't have to be a scientist or any special skills. Most people are very good at taking care of plants. They have the skills automatically, and it's a question of learning a little more and engaging deeply with the landscape. But yeah, I think it's possible.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Aparna, and thank you, Dr. Shankar Raman, for this wonderful conversation. So I'll see you in the next conversation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye, Aparna.